Chapter 11. We drove along the coast for about 6 miles, then pulled up another dirt road. This one wasn't so narrow, and it was populated by 10 or so small houses. The one we pulled up to was the last in the row, set back in the trees. Gunnar eyed the trees warily, and I looked around as well. The moon was high. Though it was only a little over half full, it still cast a good glow of light on the surrounding area. Even so, there were shadows within shadows. I squinted into the bushes, checking for werewolves with red eyes, but I couldn't see anything other than trees, brush, weeds, and grass. As I scanned, a small section of the undergrowth caught my eye. It looked like it had been tamped down a bit, like someone had come in from the woods. A chill ran down my spine, and I hastened to catch up with Gunnar. He knocked briskly on the front door. After a few beats, an old woman answered. She'd clearly been waiting for us. She was elderly, with a full head of white hair, and her back bowed by time. She stooped as she leaned on an intricately carved cane. "It's happening again, Gunnar," she warned, her voice querulous. "We don't know that," he tried to reassure her. "It could be lots of things." But he grimaced, and I didn't quite believe him. The woman's mouth tightened. She didn't either. I'd seen the unease on Gunnar's face. No matter what he said, he was worried, too. He'd faced a raging werewolf with a shotgun and a grin, so what the heck were they so afraid of? "Come in," the old lady said firmly. "I made tea." My ears pricked up. Tea was just what I needed to settle myself after cutting off someone's head. Tea solved everything except shitty family dynamics. I'd had many high teas with my mother, and they'd solved fuck all. Tea was something we'd used to gloss over the cracks, and it had turned out that it wasn't terribly good as putty. The old lady led us into a small living room, all flower prints and doilies, like something out of a history book. Everything looked old. I guess she didn't believe in modernizing, but each to their own and all that. Before we sat, Gunnar introduced us. "Mrs. Wright, this is Bunny." "Bunny, Mrs. Wright is our oldest resident. I've been here since 1793, she said with a smile. Apparently so had her furniture. I guess she wasn't human. I tried to school my features, but my eyebrows had already risen of their own accord. I pulled them back down and tried to look unfazed. She chuckled, pleased to have gotten a reaction from me. "I'm not what I seem. Evidently. Are any of us?" I asked lightly. She smirked. "Rarely. You've got a point there, dearie. Just bear with me one moment." She popped into the kitchen, then returned carrying a silver tea service. Her warning glare as she came in told me an offer of help would not be kindly received. She was obviously fiercely protective of her independence. We waited patiently as she put the tray down and started pouring. She didn't ask us our preferences. It looked like we were all getting tea, white, no sugar, which was perfect for me. Despite her age, her hands were steady. When we each held a delicate, flowered teacup and saucer, we settled into chat. Gunnar looked faintly ridiculous as he tried to handle the fragile cup in his massive hand. She might as well have given him a thimble to sip from. "Why do you think it's happening again?" he asked. I was mystified, but no doubt I'd piece it all together, or more likely, Gunnar would fill in the blanks afterwards. I couldn't help but feel that the werewolf at the office and whatever this was were connected, and I suspected Gunnar did too. For whatever reason, he was downplaying it. Mrs. Wright lowered her cup. I heard it out there. She looked at the wall of her house, staring into the woods behind it. "You're sure it wasn't an animal?" She scoffed. "I know the animals in these parts. It wasn't anything we know." "What did it sound like?" Gunnar moved to the edge of his seat, his tea forgotten. "Impossible to describe." She grimaced, but tried to describe it anyway. "A wailing, crying scream. You won't know it until you hear it for yourself." "A banshee," he offered. "I know a banshee's wail when I hear one," she objected indignantly. You said there was a break-in. What happened?" "It's better if I show you." I reluctantly set down the tea and followed Mrs. Wright out of her back door. We crossed the garden, which was surprisingly well kept for someone who appeared so frail, to the edge of a low fence. She stopped. "Gunnar, you know, I'm at the edge of the barrier here." She pointed at something with her cane. I had excellent vision even in the dark, and Gunnar must have had the same, because he didn't squint. His intake of breath let me know he saw precisely what I did. Mrs. Wright's cane pointed unerringly to a rock cairn. Even in the dark I could see that it was a new formation. No moss grew on the stones and there was no dirt. The stones were freshly cleaned and recently placed here. My neck and scalp prickled. The cairn was a perfectly formed pyramid, and at the top was a twisted wooden figure, a crude doll with a sharp stick through its middle. I shivered. No. Mistaking the meaning. It was Chapter 12. I swallowed hard and took an inadvertent step back towards the house. 1. Raging werewolf was enough for me to deal with today. If a small creepy girl came out of the woods singing a tune, I was swimming all the way back to England. Gunnar peered through the trees around us. The night was silent, the wind utterly still. Nothing moved. And it should have. I was close to peeing my big girl pants. He grunted. Let's go inside. He didn't have to tell me twice. When we got back to the house, we didn't sit back down but went straight to the front door. I looked longingly at my half-finished cup of tea. Next time, I'd know to down it. As we left, Gunnar told Mrs. Wright, I'll let the council know. Be quick about it, Gunnar. I got the feeling that she was used to having the last word. We climbed into the SUV and drove off. For once I didn't ask any questions. I found I didn't want the answers. The next stop was the Fox place. Gertrude, Gunnar had called her. When he knocked on the door, a skinny woman with short spiky hair and a pinched face answered it. About time, Gunnar, she bitched. That bastard is at it again. This time you need to take him in. Has he done anything illegal? Gunnar asked with admirable patience. It was clearly a question he'd asked multiple times before. Her lips pinched further. He's trespassing. Is he a fox or a man? She spat the words in disgust. He's a fox. You know I can't do anything but talk to him. There are no laws to prevent animals trespassing. There should be, Gertrude huffed. If I see him again, I'm shooting him. Can shoot any fox that goes after my chickens. Not in town, Gertrude, Gunnar said firmly, his jovial tone gone. We can't have citizens blasting away, and there's houses and families on either side of your yard. She sank away from him and he softened his tone. I'll go talk to him, all right. She nodded, but the look in her eyes said it wasn't all right. In the slightest. We walked to the fence gate and let ourselves into her backyard. Remy, Gunnar bellowed. Instantly a silver fox came trotting over. That's enough. Gunnar snarled. You're going to cause Gertrude to shoot someone. Go home or one day I'll let her take a chunk out of you with her shotgun. I don't want to be called here again. Do you understand? The fox blinked its luminous eyes at him and gave a single nod. Well, go on then. The fox trotted off and slithered under the fence to his own yard, I presumed. That seemed easy, I remarked. Until he gets bored again. Let's hope it lasts longer than a week this time. Gunnar's tone was grim. One day soon I'm going to get called to a body here. But I don't know whether the corpse will be Gertrude's or Remy's. I'll drive you home, he offered. Thanks, that would be great. When he pulled up to my house he turned to me, his expression serious. Well, you've had your first real taste of what it means to work with the Nomo. What do you think? You want me to arrange a transfer for you to somewhere else? Panic lanced through me. I can't go back. Not to London, he assured me. I wouldn't hand you back to that piece of crap, flouting the rules like that. He shook his head in disgust. No, if you don't like this work, I'll get you a place in another supernat town. Most aren't quite as wild as ours. I don't want to go, I said softly, and I was surprised at how true that was. The werewolf attack thing was a bit of a surprise, but mostly it's foxes and dolls, right? Gunnar barked a laugh. I won't lie to you. I'd say it's 50-50, kid. You handled yourself well, but this position isn't for everyone. Sydney doesn't ride with me for a reason, but I need a number 2 and I think you could be. If it'll be too much, I'd rather you say so now before I invest my time and heart into you. God, but how I wish someone would invest their heart into me. It's not too much, I blurted. And it's like anything, right? You get used to it. Some do, some don't. He assessed me. I reckon you will. Good, because I'm all in, Gunnar. You're not getting rid of me that easily. Werewolf schmerwolf. Tension eased from his shoulders and he beamed at me with genuine warmth in his eyes. I'm glad to hear it, Bunny, real glad. I smiled back. I was as stubborn as they come. I'd decided Portlock was going to be my new home and it was going to be, damn it. And if something was going On In This Town I wanted to find out what. Chapter 13. I lost track of the days that followed in a flurry of mundane events and paperwork. Stan had spoken to his werewolves and the corpse in the morgue wasn't one of his. It remained a John Doe whilst we waited for his prints to be processed. In the movies the results took minutes, but in the real world it took days. Until we had a name, the body and the case were on ice. I was starting to love my job. As he'd promised, Gunnar spent a lot of time and energy showing me the ropes, and I also enjoyed those few hours when Sydney and I got to work together because usually we were ships in the night. Between the three of us, we provided 24-hour cover for the Nomo's office. As far as I could tell, Gunnar didn't need sleep and rarely seemed to go home. His wife, Sigrid, must have been a tolerant woman, though I hadn't yet managed to meet her. I was beginning to doubt whether she existed. Fluffy loved coming to the office, and catching sight of him always made Gunnar smile a little wider. He really was a dog person. On the second day, a brand new dog bed appeared next to my desk, together with a bowl of water. Fluffy seemed to enjoy his new job and faithfully followed me around the office as I went to the photocopier and the filing cabinet and back again. Before I knew it, Friday rolled around and it was time for the Supernatural Council meeting. I was nervous but trying to hide it. The shifts I worked with Gunnar were long and they never seemed to go quite as planned, so I hadn't had much downtime or met many locals, other than the few I'd run across as part of the job. The council would be full of people I didn't know, supernaturals I hadn't yet encountered. Here's hoping Mum's years of etiquette training meant that I wouldn't make a complete fool of myself. The meeting started at 8 p.m. but Gunnar and I were going in early to set up the snacks and handle the security as people came in. That made me more nervous. I didn't want a machete flung at me. Before Portlock, the most fighting I'd done was to take down a few handsy guys at my old club, and that one time I'd defended myself against the creepy vampire that turned me. Of course I'd kneed him and then knifed him in the balls, so maybe I had a gift for knife wielding. Who knew? I had no idea what kind of security I could offer, other than my keen powers of observation, but Gunnar seemed more than capable of handling it. Hopefully. I'd only be there to pick up the paperwork slack. If there was one thing you could say about Gunnar, it was that he despised paperwork. The council room was a standard government room with mottled gray and blue carpet, padded plastic chairs, and light gray walls. Boring and depressing as fuck. For some reason, I'd expected something more from the Supernatural Council, but I guess discreet was the Supernat's watchword. Sydney had laid out refreshments, a large coffee decanter as well as hot water for tea, thank all the gods. I looked through the sad sack tea bags and wrinkled my nose. I could at least upgrade those before the next meeting. Maybe these Americans would like tea if they drank a better quality. Gunnar arrived and had me moved to the main doors. He had a table blocking the way in with an assortment of strongboxes under it. The boxes were solid and had some runes painted on them. Whatever they were for, they were heavy duty. I frowned. What's with the boxes? He grinned, his white teeth flashing under his copious facial hair. For securing weapons. He winked. You're in for a treat. He really believed in learning by doing, but sometimes his lack of instruction or prior warning was annoying. This was America. Would everyone come in carrying 10 guns each? In England, you needed a license to carry a gun, and it was difficult to buy one. Here it was much easier. Having said that, the only guns I'd seen since I'd arrived were Gunnar's shotguns. Most people probably concealed them. Gunnar checked his watch. Any time now, he said confidently. The show was about to commence. I fiddled restlessly with the charm around my neck. My mouth was bone dry because I was so nervous. I was about to meet the leaders of the supernatural community, and old insecurities were looming large. Mum had always put so much pressure on me to impress the right people, to be accepted into the right circles. All that had happened was that I'd tried too hard and no one had liked me, so I'd had a lonely childhood. My best friend had been my Nana. As I'd grown up, I'd collected superficial friends, but I doubted that any of them had batted an eyelid when I'd fallen off the radar. I'd had no texts, no missed calls, nothing. At best, they'd been fair-weather friends. Now I ditched my phone so they couldn't reach me if they tried, but it was hard to feel like it was a loss. If I didn't fit in here, would I be sent away? How secure was my job? I chewed my thumbnail. I couldn't go back to Europe, not for 100 years. If I did, I'd be imprisoned and nothing more than an indentured servant. Given to my slimeball sire as a plaything. All the nopes. I tried to level my breathing and act cool. Fake it till you make it, right? Hell, I beheaded a rampaging werewolf. I could handle anything they threw at me. Probably. I pulled back my shoulders and tried to drown out my mother's voice harping on about the importance of good posture. Stand here, Gunnar instructed, gesturing to a place by his side. Us supernaturals are nothing if not predictable. We carry our chosen items around with us like comfort blankets. Your job is to note who brings what so we can give it back at the end of the meeting. It sounded simple enough and I gave him a thumbs up. Here we go, he murmured. Look lively, kid. As a man approached the table, Gunnar raised his voice and announced briskly, Mafu Finau Mayor. I searched for his name on the list, feeling a little stressed when I couldn't immediately find it. Why the fuck wasn't the list alphabetical? I bet Gunnar had written it. Nope, paperwork was not his strength. I finally found the name and gave it a tick. The mayor handed over a long wooden stick about 2 inches thick and 2 feet long, not short enough to be a wand, not long enough to be a staff. For all I knew, it could have been his dog's favorite stick. Gunnar placed it in a lockbox and I wrote big stick next to Mayor Mafu's name. Gunnar's lips twitched when he saw my notation. I took a moment to study and memorize the list. With my superior recall, the next name wouldn't be so panic-inducing. Mafu was clearly Polynesian, although I didn't know from precisely where, and he was massive. He had to be 6'5" or 6, and he was heavyset to go with it. It was hard to tell if his bulk was made of muscle or fat, but either way I wouldn't be sassing him. He was dressed in a suit jacket, shirt, tie, and a native kilt with grass flip-flops on his feet. The skirt thing felt out of place, but maybe it was his formal dress. I was woefully ignorant of indigenous culture, something I'd be rectifying soon. Mafu had manicured fingers and pedicured toes. He was a man who took care of himself, so muscles rather than fat. Liv Fox, magic leader, Gunnar announced a few moments later as a woman swept in, wearing a smart suit, shoulders back, head at a haughty angle. I found her name instantly and ticked off her name off before looking up to see what weapon, if any, she was carrying. Apparently Gunnar was wondering the same thing. He waited, arms folded, face impassive, and simply stared at her. I took her measure. She was tall and dark-skinned, with dark eyes and wide lips and a perfectly symmetrical face. Her beauty was startling. It was rare that anyone was truly symmetrical. Atop her head rested a beautifully maintained afro with a silver streak that arched from her right temple past her ear. It was distinctive and my eyes were drawn to it. For a moment I couldn't look away from her, but then she caught my eye and smirked. Her dark eyes were ancient, cold, and calculating. I had a sudden vision of ancient sands and sweltering sun, and I saw her standing on a dais like an empress or a goddess with thousands of people bowing before her. She was dressed in white and gold and wore an elaborate headdress. She met my gaze and smirked again. I blinked and the vision was gone as suddenly as it had arrived. Was it something that she had sent me? Or something else? I shook my head to clear it, trying to ground myself in the room. What had she done to me? I didn't know whether to feel pissed off at the thought or afraid. I settled somewhere in the middle and made sure not to meet her gaze again. Something told me that she was not to be fucked with. Gunnar pointedly cleared his throat. Liv Fox handed him an object disdainfully and sighed, as if it were all a massive imposition. I saw a flash of blue and black, then Gunnar placed the item in one of the boxes. He looked her over again, but this time he seemed satisfied. He stepped aside to allow her in. He gestured for me to lean in and murmured, "One magical scarab." I dutifully wrote that down next to Liv's name. My head still felt strange, so I cast my mind back to the moment when she'd walked in and recalled the exact memory. I re-examined it and focused on Liv. She'd been fingering something in her pocket as she'd looked at me. The scarab. She'd definitely sent me that vision, but what? Chapter 14. I was still feeling a little dazed when Connor Mackenzie sauntered in. That was enough to shake me out of my weird funk. No way was he seeing me unless I appeared to be in full control of my faculties. He already seemed to have decided I was flighty. I didn't need to give him any more ammo. Sheer churlishness made me wait until Gunnar announced, "Connor Mackenzie, vampire leader." Before I ticked off his name, Connor appeared to have made Little effort with his appearance and he was still dressed as a lumberjack. Damn the man for looking good in plaid, but you'd think he'd have at least made an effort for the council. Without being prompted, he pulled a handgun from the back of his jeans and a knife from his boot. I recorded them as Gunnar placed the weapons in a different box. When I looked up, Connor had already gone into the main room, without so much as a "Hey, how are you doing?" to his latest vampire. Guessed he was one of those hands-off leaders. That was fine, I didn't want his hands anywhere near me anyway. I could hear voices in the council chamber and they didn't sound happy. My anxiety spiked. I tried to focus on my task. The shouting wasn't anything to do with me. Hopefully. Next in line was the most ethereal woman I'd ever seen. Thin and lithe, she moved with a sinuous grace. Her skin was a warm brown, but she had the palest sea blue eyes. Her hair was also blue, though a darker shade, and I wondered if it was natural or dyed that color. It was clear she was not human and never had been. No human moved like that. She had an alien poise and fluidity, like a professional dancer's. I tried not to stare, but it was hard. She really was something else. Calliope Galenus, Gunnar announced. The siren leader, he murmured to me. Her hand floated out and deposited something into Gunnar's hand. He held it up so I could see before dropping it into her box. I wasn't quite sure what to write. Pretty shell didn't sound professional, so I upgraded it to pearlescent shell. She swayed her way in, and her two attendants, a male and female, each handed over 2-foot-long tridents for the box. Fricking tridents. That was insane. I held on to my poker face with effort. Who carried actual tridents around with them? Despite their length, they disappeared into the box, and I looked at it sharply. They shouldn't have fit. I guess I had to leave logic at the door along with any weapons. There was a scuffle and a few sharp words inside the council room. Gunnar's eyes narrowed and his booming voice rang out. Stop that or you're out for the night. The noise stopped instantly. It seemed that no one wanted to fuck with Gunnar. Next up was Stan, the shifter leader, the man I'd met during the fight in the street. He'd made an effort to clean up for the meeting. He was tall and well built, with brown hair and piercing hazel eyes. He looked like he had dual heritage, with dark skin and exotic features. Like Connor, he wore jeans, though he'd paired them with a long-sleeved dark shirt. The shirt was tucked in and showed off his muscular chest that tapered down to a slim waist and hips. When my eyes made it back up to his face, I found that he was smirking at me. My cheeks warmed. This time when Gunnar cleared his throat, it was directed at me. I mumbled, "Sorry." Luckily my boss looked amused. "We'll try this again. Stan Amogak, shifter leader." I marked him off and raised my head in time to see Stan looking me over with the same blatant interest I'd accidentally shown him. Gunnar raised his eyebrows at Stan, tacitly asking for his weapon of choice. Stan shrugged. "None. I am a weapon." Then that smirk again. "No weapon, no entourage." Either he was cocky or he was dangerous, perhaps both though. Connor had slammed him into a wall with relative ease. The queue had dwindled to one. The last person was a bulky indigenous man, but unlike Mafu, he wasn't dressed in traditional garb. He wore camouflage trousers and a tight black top that showed off corded muscles. He looked to be flirting with 40. His clear brown skin had a few lines and his short black hair was flecked with silver. He was average height, and he was solid. He looked like he could move a mountain if he so desired. There was an energy about him that impressed me, and I wondered what kind of supernatural he was. A werewolf? Maybe. His eyes were piercing, and I knew that, like me, he saw everything. Damned hyper-awareness. Gunnar pulled out the last lockbox, this one larger than the others. Thomas. Pack attack, human leader. Human. Of all the people that had come through, I'd have pegged this man as a supernatural. He was focused and intense, and I sensed he was as dangerous as those who had magic. I dutifully ticked his name and waited for him to divest his gun or whatever he carried. Sure enough, he pulled a handgun from the back of his jeans. I wrote it down and went to put down my pen, but then he pulled out 2 more guns from places I'd missed, maybe from under his jacket. He didn't stop, he pulled several wooden stakes, 3 long silver knives, 10 throwing knives, a curved blade, a sickle, 2 blades that I'd have to ask Gunnar about, and a hatchet. Once he'd finished, he held up his hands. Gunnar looked him over thoughtfully and raised an eyebrow. Thomas grinned and pulled 2 more knives. Gunnar huffed. With an unrepentant grin, Thomas pulled out a small handgun from his boot. I looked at the pile of weaponry in the box and gawked. Gunnar double-checked my list. Not a hatchet, a tactical tomahawk. And yes, that was a sickle. These knives. He pointed at the two strangely curved blades that look like claws, are karambits. The big knife is a bowie, and that one is. He picked it up and examined it for a minute. Some type of modified kukri. Thomas nodded and looked impressed at Gunnar's knowledge. I corrected my list and Gunnar placed the weapons one at a time into a strong box. Once he was done, he locked it and put the keys in his pocket. Thomas nodded again and moved inside. Despite the fact that he was now unarmed, he still felt like one of the most dangerous people in the room. Why does he have so many weapons? I asked curiously as Gunnar completed his remaining tasks. He's a hunter. With all of those weapons, it begged the question, what does he hunt? Gunnar's smile was grim and humorless. U.S. Chapter 15. After the last council member had entered, we screened about 20 or so locals who wanted to attend. Apparently the meetings were thrown open to keep the proceedings transparent. Only one or two of the locals had weapons, the rest seemed to have left theirs at home. It was a shame the council members weren't as smart. But then they would have missed out on all that posturing and drama, which they'd seemed to enjoy so much. Gunnar and I went into the council chambers, where everyone had descended like vultures on the food and drinks. My nervousness returned full force. My boss was about to parade me like a prize pony, just like Mum used to do. I wondered how long his introductory speech would last. Mum's had always seemed interminable. He smiled kindly. I'll make it fast, then you can get a snack and sit in the back. No one will even notice you. He locked the door into the council chamber for security, no doubt, but I suddenly felt constrained. I was locked in as much as any others were locked out. I smiled back wanly. Thanks. I'd be grateful if you could get it over with quickly. He chuckled. Come on, little rabbit, let's end your suffering. I followed him up front to a 70s-style wooden dais. Gunnar fiddled with the mic for a moment until a loud screech had everyone covering their ears in pain. Well, that was one way to shut you all up, he said. There were a few grins in response. He knew his audience. Gunnar nodded at Sydney, which was her cue to start taking the minutes, then hit the dais with a small gavel. The noise resonated through the room. I call to order the monthly meeting of the Portlock Supernatural Council. Presiding, Mayor Finau. Temporary Speaker, Council Member Gunnar Johansson. Minutes by Secretary and Treasurer Sydney Fletcher. He adjusted the mic a little. His voice was so loud and booming that I couldn't be the only one who wished he wouldn't use it at all. Before we begin, I wanted to introduce my new assistant. He looked at me and gestured for me to step forward. This is Bunny Barrington, and she's working in the office and the field. She's a new vampire, so don't be tempting her with any spilled blood tonight. There were a few titters from the crowd at what was obviously meant to be a joke. I caught Connor's eye. He was frowning and looking at me intently. Well, almost everyone thought it was a joke. She's from London, England, so go easy on her with your wild Alaskan ways. Gunnar's tone was jovial, but there was a hint of warning in his eyes. Go easy on her or else. It warmed me. Nobody had had my back like that in a long time, not since my Nana had passed. There was a polite round of applause and Gunnar dismissed me. That was it? God, it had been virtually painless compared to the rambling introductions I'd endured at Mum's hands. I walked away from the dais with a sigh of relief, grabbed a pastry and sat in the back row behind Sydney to watch the room. Gunnar went through some council business first, and just like he'd said, no one was even looked at me. I sat and munched quietly, a cup of tea cooling on the empty chair next to me. I tuned in again as Gunnar started talking about the missing people. I'm sorry to say that we are no further along in finding Jack Taylor, though I have some news to give you in a moment that might have further bearing on the issue. He sounded grim. Connor, do you have any update on Kivik Sakari's disappearance? He was last seen at his residence. No further sightings have been documented. Connor stood up. Obviously frustrated, he said. Nothing further to add. Have spoken to all of my people. Kivik hasn't been seen. His jaw worked for a moment, but then he sat back down. Gunnar licked his lips. He looked almost nervous. Mrs. Wright appears to have Had a visitor to the edge of the barrier. She says she heard it. Noise exploded into the room and Connor surged to his feet. Gunnar banged his gavel. And reluctantly the crowd settled. I know this is scary news, especially with Jack and Kivik missing. It's a reminder to be vigilant, more so than ever. Are there any rips in the barrier? Stan asked grimly. Gunnar shook his head. None yet. I undertook a full sweep after my meeting with Mrs. Wright and I didn't see any tears or fissures. He paused. But in some areas it looked thinner. People started muttering again and the room filled with a tense hubbub. Finally one of the townsmen, a man called Ahote, raised his hand. Gunnar nodded at him. What proof does she have? Ahote shuffled as he spoke. He looked restless, worried. Gunnar scratched his jaw and looked like he wanted to be somewhere else. Anywhere else. He cleared his throat. There was a cairn with a stick doll perched on top at the edge of the barrier. It was speared through. He cleared his throat again. There's more. Bunny and I were attacked in the Nomos office by a werewolf. Stan has confirmed none of our werewolves are missing. The silence that fell was absolute until Connor broke it. You think the mutt came through the barrier? Either that or someone is making new werewolves in town. The room filled with voices again. Connor spoke over them. Do we have an ID for the werewolf? I presume it's on ice now. Bunny dispatched it, Gunnar confirmed. Everyone swiveled to look at me. Their disbelief obvious. I gave an awkward finger wave and they turned back to Gunnar. No ID yet, he said. But we should get the results of the prints any day now. What do we do? Someone shouted over the noise. Gunnar grimaced. He didn't have a plan of action. For now, nothing. We watch. We assess, we stay vigilant. Stay inside the barrier and make sure everyone does the same. I want it clear to all factions that no one is to go wandering about. Be alert, be safe. I'm not imposing a curfew. The unspoken yet was clear. Chapter 16. Gunnar changed the subject. On to other matters. Stan, you're up. The shifter leader took the podium, looked around, then addressed someone in the crowd. We agreed to hold off until the fish plant raised their prices on salmon, but Smoky Bay is out fishing. He was looking at one of the seats, but I couldn't tell at whom. A man's voice answered. We don't have the funds like PB. We have to fish. I'm talking, Stan growled. Wait your turn. If we don't work together, we'll all lose money. If we don't get them over 375, we'll all be tightening our belts. Stan nodded. Now I'm done. There was further muttering in the crowd, but this time the noises were of assent. Gunnar's eyes were roving over them all, poised for trouble. The mayor took the stand. Stan stood to one side but didn't leave the stage. I realized that was probably why Gunnar was presiding over this meeting. The mayor was involved in this disagreement. Mayor Mafu spoke firmly. Smoky Bay is just starting out. We have to fish and sell at whatever price we're given or we'll go under. Asking us to hold out is killing the business. There were a few here's in the crowd. I leaned forward. What is going on? I whispered to Sydney. She turned and whispered back. Fish. Apparently the processing plant isn't giving a good rate on gutted and gilled salmon per pound, so they want to drive up the price artificially by not bringing them fish. Oh. I tuned back in. The debate was getting a little more heated. Stan was yelling, and Calliope and Liv had joined in. Was everyone involved in the fishing industry here? I was going to have to bone up on my fish knowledge. I knew a little about caviar, swordfish and bluefin tuna, but apart from that I wasn't much of a pescatarian. I leaned towards juicy steaks. Guess that would have to change since I was evidently living in a fishing village. I'm not pulling my fishermen, Mafu said firmly. We'll keep fishing. He folded his arms across his vast chest. His feet were spread wide, grass skirt. Or not, it was clear he meant business. Stan squared up to him. Tempers were fraying. The two big men were chest to chest yelling at each other. Then Stan prodded Mafu. Tension ratcheted up. Few men and women in the crowd were standing up now, and virtually everyone was shouting. You're killing our economy, Stan growled. I have to feed my family, the mayor yelled back. Feed 'em fish, you line-jumping bastard. Stan bit back sharply. Enough, Connor roared. The barrier is weakening, we have people missing, we have a rogue werewolf attacking people, and you're arguing about fucking fish. Stan glowered. You would too if it was your livelihood. Just fuck off and polish your wood. Leave us to discuss real men's work. This wasn't what I'd expected of a council meeting. Connor snarled and his fangs flashed. The Nomo banged the gavel again. Meeting dismissed. Everyone ignored him and continued arguing. Stan had turned his attention back to Mafu and the two were fronting up to each other. Stan pushed Mafu, Mafu pushed back. Gunnar rolled towards them. Stop, he barked. They didn't. Stan reared back and threw a punch. That seemed to be like waving a flag and fights broke out. All over the room. I stayed well back. What is Gunnar? I asked Sydney. He said he's not a vampire but he's strong. He certainly wasn't intimidated by the two big men fighting in front of him. Demigod, she answered. You're joking. I scoffed. She shrugged. Nope. Huh. I hadn't even known that demigods were real. I guess there was a lot I didn't know was real. So Connor's not in fish? I asked. Nah, he's in logging. Logging? I asked. Like an actual lumberjack? Sydney smirked. It's not exactly like you are picturing. I grinned and sang the line. He's a lumberjack and he's okay. She looked at me blankly. What? Monty Python, I said. She still looked blank. British comedians, I explained. They did a sketch about lumberjacks. I'll play it for you some time. I brought the conversation back to Connor. Anyway, how do you know what I'm picturing? Nowadays lumberjacks use chainsaws and heavy machinery. You're picturing a sweaty guy with an axe. I was, and without a shirt too, and maybe some high heels. I grinned. That one, she tilted her head toward Connor, owns the company. He isn't swinging an axe anymore. More's the pity. He'd look good doing that. Does everyone else in town work with fish? I asked curiously because there certainly seemed to be a lot of people shouting about it. We have three main industries: fishing, logging and mining. The mining isn't so big and the shifters are all over it. But fishing? That's the biggest. I looked up in time to see the mayor sail into some chairs as people scrambled out of the way. Snarling, Stan rumbled in after Mafu. Then they were rolling around on the floor. Individual fights were escalating in the crowd and I could suddenly smell blood in the air. Gunnar looked over at me. Stay back, he mouthed to me. I gave him a thumbs up. Looking relieved that I wasn't going to wade in, he and Connor joined the melee. Gunnar grabbed Stan and Connor pulled up the mayor. Enough! The Nomo bellowed. Like a switch had been flicked. The whole room fell deathly silent. The brawlers paused mid-punch and everyone froze. Was it out of fear or as a demigod? Did Gunnar have some other sort of magic? I said, meeting adjourned. He ground out. You'll come pick up your weapons at the office tomorrow. I'm not giving them back now when you're acting like a bunch of hotheads. I'll call you each with an appointment. And don't you dare take this out into the streets or I'll haul your asses in. The threat hung in the air. Most people looked a little shamefaced though. Stan was still flushed with anger as he shrugged off Gunnar and stormed out. Liv and Calliope were glaring at each other, both of them with messed up hair. And their clothing askew. Slowly and sullenly the crowd dispersed. It was safe to say my first council meeting was a total shambles. On the plus side, I needn't have worried about being introduced to the community. After that shit show, no one would be thinking about me. So what was decided? I asked Gunnar once everyone had filed out except Sydney and me. He frowned darkly. Absolutely nothing, unfortunately. Mark my words, someone is going to get hurt over this one. I felt a shiver of foreboding run down my spine. Something told me he was right, but I didn't know whether he was talking about fish or the bear. Chapter 17. The next day, Sydney invited me over for dinner. It was supposed to be my first night off and I felt a warm glow at the thought of spending it with a friend. I hadn't had a real friend in well ever. I'd had social friends, work friends and some girls I wanted to be friends with, but I was firmly discouraged from those because they weren't socially acceptable enough for my mother. She wanted me to associate only with people a degree above us in the social hierarchy. Her narrow views had constricted my social circle to a group of one me. She certainly wouldn't have approved of me befriending a half-blood mermaid who worked for a living scandalous. There again, she probably wasn't that crazy about a vampire daughter who was a failed waitress either. Distance helped me care less about her views, that and the fact that she and Dad hadn't helped me escape London when I'd asked them to. Dad's business empire relied on a good working relationship with the vampire king of Europe, so they had encouraged me to embrace my 100 years of servitude. Weeks later it still stung that they had chosen Dad's business and wealth over me, their only daughter. I was surprised when tears sprang to my eyes. Maybe I wasn't over it as much as I pretended to be. I swiped at them, then drank a cup of warmed blood, swallowing the dark liquid down over the lump in my throat. Fluffy gave a soft whine and pressed his body against my legs in comfort. I'm okay, I promised, giving a shaky laugh. I just have shitty parents, I guess. When I moved out, I thought my opinion of them had already hit rock bottom, but it seems there were still some more depths to plumb. I stroked his head. Now we're at rock bottom. I'm their only daughter and they're supposed to put me first. I know that sounds selfish, but all the time I see these parents who would do anything for their kids and mine wouldn't even lend me the plane fare to get here. I dashed at the next few tears. I'm okay, I repeated firmly. It doesn't matter, they don't matter. I'll probably never see them again. Why did saying that out loud hurt my chest so much? Let's go to Sydney's, I said in as light a tone as I could manage. I put a collar on Fluffy and looped his lead around my neck so I could carry it hands free. He was so well behaved that he didn't really need it, but I wanted one with me just in case. Then, needing to be prepared for every eventuality, I grabbed a couple of poo bags and shoved them in my pocket. It wasn't hard to find Sydney's house. Like me, her accommodation was provided by the Nomo's office. She lived only 3 doors down from me in the row of houses that the council had arranged for its workers. The only difference between our places was that my white-painted house had a bright blue door and her door was sea green. When I knocked, she opened it with a welcoming smile. Hey bunny Fluffy, come on in. Holding the door open, she stepped back. My first social visit with someone in ages. Here's hoping I didn't fuck this up. I could really do with a friend that wasn't a canine. Sydney's house was full of pictures, cushions, and blankets, making it cozy and charming. In contrast, mine looked sterile and barely lived in. I decided right then that when I received my first paycheck, I'd invest in some home decor. I wanted my place to feel like this, like a home. I've made some Filipino food, she said as I kicked off my shoes. I hope you like it. I'm sure I'll love it, I said honestly. My one vice was that I was a total foodie and I like to try new things. Plus it smelled absolutely divine. Fluffy clearly felt the same because he kept licking his lips and sniffing the air. I gave him a ruffle. I don't know how she feels about dogs eating her food, so be patient, I whispered to him. I'll feed you at home. I should have given him dinner before we left. Score -1 for my pet caring abilities. I'm more than happy for him to have some, Sydney announced loudly. I've cooked enough for a small army. Portion sizes are my weakness. Fluffy can absolutely try anything that's not too spicy. I guess I hadn't whispered quietly enough. Fluffy gave a happy wag and both of our stomachs growled loudly at the same moment, making Sydney laugh. Portion sizes or not, I guess I won't have leftovers, she said. I sat at the table and Fluffy leaned against my legs. Sydney named the dishes as she set them down. First a huge bowl of noodles with vegetables and maybe chicken, pancit, then a veritable stack of chicken pieces on the bone, chicken adobo, and finally a plate heaped with homemade egg rolls, lumpia. She wasn't wrong about her portion sizes, but I was up to the challenge and I ate until I thought I would burst. Fluffy enjoyed his own plate of deboned chicken. When he was finished, he rolled on his back, all 4 legs in the air, and promptly went to sleep. It was nice to see him so content. When I'd rescued him, he'd been in a terrible state. How anyone could have neglected an animal like that was beyond me. I pushed back my plate. That was the best food I've eaten in months. Thank you so much. Let me help clear the table. Oh no, you're a guest. Please let me help. Sydney relented, and I stacked the plates and carried them into the kitchen. We talked companionably whilst we washed the dishes together. Is Fluffy a purebred German Shepherd? She asked. He's very handsome. Thanks. I rescued him from a huge commercial bin. Someone had thrown him away and locked the lid. That thought still disturbed me. Oh my, how awful. People can be so cruel. The image of my sire, Franklin, flashed into my mind. He had kicked Fluffy when my dog dared to defend me and sent him slamming into a wall. At the time, Fluffy had been so thin and emaciated that I feared Franklin had killed him. My mind reared back from the violent memory and I pushed it away. I'd been silent too long and Sydney was looking at me with concern. Yes, they can, I agreed finally. Whatever had passed across my face had raised further questions, but I saw her choose not to ask them. So, I saw you admiring Stan, the shifter leader, at the meeting, she said. Instead. He's pretty good looking, I responded non-committally. Yeah, he is. He was also admiring you right back. I flushed. Flattering as that was, I'd soured a little on men. I'd picked up my sire at a club. Things had been getting hot and heavy, and he'd suggested we go outside. There in a dank dark alley he'd turned me. Later I discovered he'd been paid £50,000 to break vampire law to do it. Turning someone who was unwilling was apparently a big no-no, but, as the son of the Vampire King, Franklin felt the laws didn't apply to him. Evidently his father had agreed because the prick had gotten away with it scot-free. I'd have to vet any new man thoroughly before I'd even think of dating again. And handsome as Stan was, his temper had put me off. Even so, I could still look even if I didn't touch. Was he? I asked airily. Yep. Connor Mackenzie kept watching you too. Did he? I scoured through my memories of the council shitshow. Anytime I'd looked at Connor he'd been frowning, plus he'd insulted me twice already. He clearly hadn't warmed to me. Either that or he hated being saddled with me as a new vampire and I was a millstone around his neck. I guess in a way he's my boss. I don't really know what being the vampire leader entails, but he's just keeping an eye on me. So what about you? Asked pointedly. Are you seeing anyone? Sydney blushed prettily. I've been out twice with someone, but I don't know if anything will come of it. Ooh, tell me more. She told me a little about her dates as we finished clearing up, then retired to her sofa with glasses of wine. She passed me one of her many blankets and I sat with it on my knees. Fluffy jumped up next to me. Fluffy, I said, scandalized. Off you get. Just because it's fine at home doesn't mean it's okay elsewhere. He hung his head and started to get off. Sydney laughed. It's fine. Up you get. Fluffy finished climbing down, gave her a grateful lick, then climbed up next to me again. I'm so glad you invited us over, Sydney, I told her. It's been wonderful. Perhaps the sip of wine had loosened my tongue because I blurted out, I've never really had a girlfriend who didn't have an agenda. She looked at me with sympathy. That sucks. I'm happy to be your first one. Though. I smiled at that. I wanted to try my best to be a good friend. Friends asked after each other, right? You aren't off the hook. Tell me more about your guy. You told me about the dates, but how do you feel when you're with him? Is the spark there? I took another sip of my wine and looked at her expectantly. She blushed a little. You could say that. He's. My phone rang and at the same moment hers beeped with a text message. Hastily pulled mine out of my back pocket and looked at the screen. Gunnar. A sinking feeling in my gut told me that my day off was about to come to an abrupt end. I hurriedly swiped to accept the call. Gunnar's gruff voice was grim. I'm sorry to interrupt your evening, but I need you to get down to the harbor. There's been a murder. Chapter 18. There's been a murder, I said as soon as I hung up. Apparently so. Sydney's tone was grim. Gunnar must have texted her the same message. Let's go. My first thought was that Stan and Mafu's argument must have escalated, then I wondered if there'd been another werewolf incident. I quickly dismissed that. Gunnar had said there'd been a murder, not an attack. I looked down at my jeans and a jumper. I had no idea what one wore to a crime scene. Sydney pulled on her rubber boots as I stared at my white trainers. Should I stop by my house and grab my boots? I asked her. Yeah, that's a good idea, but quickly. The bubbly open expression she usually wore had been replaced by grim determination, like she was bracing herself for something. It suddenly occurred to me that, unlike me, she probably knew the victim. That sucked. I ran to my house and pulled on the borrowed gumboots and a waterproof jacket. I considered taking Fluffy, but since we were going to a murder scene, I decided to leave him at home. Sorry, bud, I murmured. You'd better sit this one out. I flicked on the TV, made sure he had water and headed back out. Sydney was waiting for me and together we jogged down to the harbor, urgency thrumming through us both. It was dark, but the lights at the dock were bright, and the tiki torches had been lit to ward off the mosquitoes. We could see Gunnar's massive form towards the end of the dock and a dark form lying in front of him. Before we got to the scene, I smelled the coppery tang of blood. It had an odd edge to it. I expected my fangs to drop, but nope. My fangs were the worst. They seemed to only drop when I didn't expect them to, not when I did. Like when I smelled food. I was a terrible vampire. Was it something you could fail? Maybe they'd stake me for being defective. Great, something new to worry about. Sydney looked over at me, eyes wide in sudden panic. Are you okay? She asked. All that blood. I can smell it, but I'm fine, I reassured her. Eyes wide, she shouted to Gunnar. Bunny can smell the blood. Gunnar turned and flashed her a grin. Don't worry, she's good with blood. Aren't you, Bunny? I gave him a thumbs up. All good. Sydney blinked. How are you good? You should be going into a murderous rage right now. You're still so new as a vamp. I shrugged helplessly. I don't know. I guess I'm a bit weird even for a vampire. Honestly, you don't need to worry about me. I'm fine. Let's just focus on that poor guy. I gestured to the prone body. Frankly, we had more important things to worry about than my liquid diet. Someone was flat out behind Gunnar. And he was very, very dead. Chapter 19. Freak or not, I was grateful that Gunnar was still willing to let me onto the scene. He gave me a pair of booties to slip on and some gloves all the while, shooting me sidelong glances to check I was still okay. He clapped me on the shoulder as I got closer to the body. You're doing great, he assured me, which pulled a smile from me. The truth was I had something to add here. I was very observant and my memory was second to none. I could memorize the scene not just visually but with my other senses too. I took a deep breath. Blood, yes, but there was something else scenting the air, like a bat taste fizzing at the back of my throat. It might be nothing. Then again, it might be something. If Gunnar sent me away, I'd be beside myself wondering what I was missing, not because I was especially morbid but because I desperately wanted to be an asset to the department. If he made me leave every time blood was involved, I wouldn't be a very valuable resource. Exceptional filing skills aside. Gunnar held up a hand. He was still blocking the view, but the scent of blood pervaded the night air together with that mysterious tang. Stop just there, he instructed gruffly. I haven't photographed the scene. I got here only a minute or two before you arrived. He stepped aside so that we could see the body. My first impression was a wave of blood. It looked like buckets of the stuff had been flung around. Did one body have that much blood in it? The end of the dock was soaked in it, the wooden boards saturated. Then I saw the body itself. It was nightmarish, twisted so strangely that I could barely work out what I was looking at. It certainly wasn't just human. For a start, there was fur. My eyes must have been bulging as I stared because Gunnar noticed. Werewolf, he said abruptly. Partially shifted. I'd only seen one werewolf, but it had looked far less nightmarish in its complete form than this human werewolf mashup. Its face. It was hard to think of the body as a him, though it was undoubtedly male, was so contorted that I doubted even his own mother would have recognized him. One arm was mostly human, but the other was long and hairy with a huge hand-like paw and claws. His legs were far too muscular and covered in dark wiry hair. The proof that he was male also remained partially shifted. That was a sight I'd happily have bleached from my brain if I could. A gift of vampirism was my excellent eyesight, so the next thing I noticed were the slashes all over the body. Better to focus on those than the half-mutated schlong. If I concentrated on counting, then I wouldn't be overcome by horror. I figured that breaking down and sobbing at the scene meant I wouldn't be invited to another one, so I tried hard to calm myself by counting the wounds, focusing on those rather than the fact that what lay before me was a man who had probably loved, who had a mother and father who would grieve. 33, I mumbled with a frown. That was a lot. There had been a lot of hate here. The wound across the throat had been so deep it had almost severed the head. The amount of blood sprayed around told me that the deadly wound had probably been the last. What's that? Gunnar asked. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt your thoughts. I just counted 33 wounds, though there may well be more that I can't see on his back. Gunnar was looking at me with new interest. 33 give or take, he asked faintly. No give or take, I said firmly. There are definitely 33 visible wounds, but as I said, there could be some on the other side too. Gunnar stepped closer to the body, a little way into the pool of blood. He knelt to check for a pulse and I gaped. Surely nothing could survive an attack. Like that? He saw my incredulous look. Standard procedure, he explained. You always verify death. You'd be surprised what people can survive. Especially supernats. Chastened, I nodded. He sighed. But not in this case. He stood up. Don't touch anything, I'm gonna grab my forensics kit and camera. We'll start documenting the scene. How did it get called in? I asked. An anonymous tip. The murderer? Most likely, Gunnar agreed. Anyone else would have stayed around to give a statement. Unless they were a terrified witness. Male or female? I asked. He shrugged. With AI voices so accessible these days, that doesn't mean a thing, but for what it's worth, it sounded male. Don't touch anything, he reiterated as he walked away. Sydney and I stood frozen in place. Despite being in the open, the stench of blood and death was overwhelming. Neither of us wanted to look at the body for too long, let alone get any closer to it, but I found it hard to look away. My brain kept trying to make sense of it like it was a ghoulish puzzle. It was like a train derailment or a car accident, you just couldn't look anywhere else, so I used the time to examine and memorize everything I could see. The water looked motionless, but having Sydney beside me was a reminder that it probably wasn't as still as it appeared. Mermaids, selkies, and all sorts might lurk in its depths. I shivered. The body was close to the water, was there something down there waiting to claim us if we stepped too close? Curiosity killed the cat, and maybe it would kill the bunny too, because I found myself inching closer to the water's edge. I peered over the edge of the dock, and immediately let out a blood-curdling scream as I met something's eyes. Chapter 20. Holy shit! I screamed. Sydney dashed to my side as a trident appeared from nowhere in her hands. The huge yellow eyes in the water blinked at me, totally unbothered by my cussing. I couldn't tear my eyes away. The thing in the water was huge and it glittered. It was like an eel, but the size and length of a whale at least. Was swimming calmly and idly under the jetty. I was surprised the water was deep enough for it, but it must have been because now it was under the boards below our feet. My sluggish heart gave a firm thud as I waited for the jaws moment when the sea beast leapt up and crunched Sydney, me, the body, and the boards all in one fell swoop. Sydney let out a relieved giggle. It's okay, she called back to Gunnar, who was racing back to us. Bunny just saw the water dragon. The water dragon? I repeated dumbly, still watching the flash of glitter through the slats of the board. Yeah, they're a guardian of the sea. Nothing to be feared. I imagine they sensed the blood and came to see what's up. Tension eased from Sydney's shoulders. I actually feel a heck of a lot better knowing they're here. Whatever killed the werewolf was water-based, they would be long gone. Only a fool would fight the water dragon. They? I asked. She shrugged. No one knows their gender. I wouldn't want to piss them off. Now that fear had faded, my brain kicked in. Can you ask them if they saw anything? She shrugged. In the same way you can ask God if he saw anything. So, I can ask, but I probably won't get a response. And if I did, most people would think I was crazy. Gunnar had headed back to the truck and was picking up all the equipment he'd dropped when he'd heard me scream. Sydney and I watched together as the water dragon slunk deeper into the depths of the water. They were gone, or at least, they were out of sight. Out of sight, out of mind, right? Wrong. I'd be thinking of those golden eyes for a while yet. A freaking dragon, a water one, but even so it counted. It was rare for me to be happy about being turned into the walking undead, but today had ticked off something on a bucket list I hadn't known I'd had. A howl rent the air and I stepped a little closer to Sydney. There was an answering howl and the hair on my neck stood up. Damn it, with all my focus on the water, I'd not been monitoring the surrounding area. I turned and hastily scanned the darkness. If another werewolf arrived, Gunnar would need to give me another machete. My heart gave another thud. I was getting quite the cardiovascular workout tonight. Sydney smiled. Just a normal wolf, she reassured me. We get them here. But I noticed she stepped closer to me. Sure. I tried to be calm about the idea of a pack of normal wolves converging on us, but try as I might, I couldn't stop visualizing the werewolf as it had burst through the office with its red eyes and murder on its mind. When Gunnar finally came back laden with equipment, I gave him a sheepish smile. Sorry about that. He smiled. No worries. You're not the first to scream at our water dragon. But they're a guardian, not to be feared unless you have nefarious intentions. I have none of those, I promised. Then you're good. Help me with these, won't you? I leapt forward to unburden him. Gunnar stacked everything neatly, then pulled out a large camera and proceeded to photograph the scene from every angle. He asked Sydney and me to collect samples and place them in evidence bags, which he sealed, labeled, and placed in a lockbox. I guessed that there weren't any crime scene techs here in the backwaters, just us. Lucky us. We worked in silence. To talk somehow seemed disrespectful to the corpse. It was impossible not to step in the blood because the whole place was painted with it, and I was glad for the booties. I wouldn't have wanted to get my boots covered in it even if they were ugly. All right, Gunnar said finally. Let's call it a day. Thank God for that. I was so done with swabs and blood and death. I was pretty sure I was going to smell it for days. And despite Sydney's assurances, I still couldn't let go of the image of the other murderous werewolf I'd encountered. Do you know the victim? I asked Gunnar quietly. If he's local, then I probably do. I know most of the werewolves in these parts, though not all. But if it's another out-of-town werewolf like the one that attacked us, then no. I can't tell who it is with the face half shifted like that. Once we get the body out of here and cleaned up, I'll get Stan to come by and identify him. Did you find a wallet or a phone? I asked curiously. I hadn't seen either. But maybe Gunnar had tagged and bagged them while I was doing something else. No, but we're gonna have Sydney go and take a look in the water once we're done. I looked at her. She didn't look too happy, though I thought she'd been expecting it. She'd been Gunnar's assistant since before I'd started, but she was still a little green around the gills. At least you won't have to smell the blood anymore, I said to her softly to encourage her. That was the only positive I could think of. It's not just the smell, she grimaced. I could understand her distress, though I didn't feel the same. The scene was gruesome, but after my initial shock I'd found our work fascinating. First the photos, then setting out the cones by the items of interest, then more photos, then bagging everything up, recording it in the evidence box and locking it away so the chain of evidence was unbroken. I'd always thought I'd be a good investigator, but Mum would have broken out in hives if I'd floated the idea of becoming a police officer. Now I found that I wanted to dive in to investigate this grisly crime, and the gore didn't bother me. Maybe it was a vampire thing, or maybe it was because I couldn't have known the victim. Either way, I was pleased that I was keeping a level head. Finally Gunnar said, "There's nothing else we can do here. It's up to the lab. Now, I'll call the ambulance to transport the body. Sydney, go do your thing. Please, check out 100 yards or so around this spot and head down the channel, say 500 yards. If you don't find anything at the bottom, then the current has taken them, or the murderer has them." Has taken what? I asked. The wallet and the phone? And the murder weapon and anything else suspicious. I hadn't even thought about the murder weapon. I needed to get better at this investigating malarkey. The last thing I wanted was for Gunnar to ship me back to Old Blighty. I was going to be the best damned assistant ever, even at a chilling crime. Chapter 21. Sydney started to strip off, and I whirled around to give her some privacy. Gunnar had already turned his back. "Would you hold my clothes, Bunny?" she asked. "Sure," I said lightly. I squinched my eyes shut, turned round and held my hands out blindly. She laughed. "No need to be shy on my account. Nakedness is part of my upbringing. But by all means, keep your eyes closed if it makes you feel uncomfortable." It absolutely did, but I was new Bunny, and new Bunny wasn't going to be a prude. I opened my eyes but kept them firmly at head height as Sydney passed me her clothes. Finally she stood naked, her arms crossed over her chest in deferment to my obvious discomfort. "Isn't the water insanely cold?" I asked. "Don't you need a wetsuit or something?" She laughed out loud. "Mermaid. Don't worry, once I shift I won't be cold." She gave me a finger wave, then ran and dived off the pier. Tiny splash rippled where she entered the water. A couple of seconds later her head popped up. Only it wasn't the Sydney I was used to seeing. My mouth dropped open. In place of her hair was a mohawk made of tiny tendrils like a jellyfish. Her eyes were significantly larger and totally black. Her skin was no longer the bronze of her mixed blood, but two-toned dark bluish-gray on her back, fading to a lighter shade on her front. Her breasts were gone, fins had sprouted down her arms, and she waved at me with a hand that was webbed. Amazed, I swallowed and waved back. She broke up out of the water like a fish, and then dived back down. Her large pearlescent fluke caught the fluorescent lights, and then she was gone. We waited. After about 10 minutes I started to worry. How long can she stay underwater? I asked Gunnar. He shrugged. Far as I know, forever. Oh. I had assumed that as a mammal she would need to breathe air, but she wasn't just a mammal but a magical creature. Sydney was so lovely and a girl next door, kind of a way that half the time I forgot she was supernatural. Hell, half the time I forgot I was supernatural. How long do you think it will take for her to search the area? I asked. Don't know. Gunnar stared anxiously at the water. He wasn't as unconcerned as he was trying to appear with his laconic answers. She'll be okay with the water dragon, right? He squeezed my shoulder. You're a good friend. She'll be fine. A heavy silence fell again as we waited next to the cooling corpse. A chill ran down my spine as I realized it really was eerily silent. There were no birds calling, no cars on the road. It felt like everyone and everything had the good sense to vamoose, and only us idiots stood on the dock waiting, with targets on our backs. My fangs snicked down. Great. Where had they been when I was confronted by a freaking water dragon? Nowhere, that's where. The coppery smell of blood invaded my nostrils for almost an hour before Sydney finally emerged from the water. She landed in human form, naked, on the balls of her feet on the dock behind us. Neat. 10 out of 10 for style. She looked pleased. I didn't find the wallet or the murder weapon, but I did find this. She held out a cell phone. Water was pouring from it, but I noticed that not a drop remained on her skin. Cool trick. Nice work. Gunnar held out an evidence bag, sealed it, and put it in the evidence box. I passed Sydney her clothes and she hastily pulled them on as her flesh goose pimpled in the cold. Hopefully the cell is the victim's or the killer's, she said optimistically. We can hope, but realistically it could belong to anyone. Gunnar sighed. Probably every fisherman from this town has dropped a phone in the drink. Now, we're all dressed and on dry land, let's wrap this up. He dialed the ambulance. While we waited, we bagged and tagged our booties and gloves in case we touched something that later transpired to be important. The ambulance showed up quickly. It was a small town and everything seemed to be pretty close, plus I doubted they had many murders. Gunnar and Sydney weren't acting like this was any old day. They walked up to meet the ambulance, but I continued to look at the body. Something was itching at the back of my mind, something I was seeing but couldn't put my finger on. It wasn't until the stretcher thunked down on the wooden pier that I realized what it was. The victim had obviously been stabbed, and I was fairly certain that was the cause of death, but his muzzle was wet and there was a lot of drool around his mouth. His pupils were blown open in pain or something else. Were those simply signs of a werewolf shifting, or had he been ill? But I'd read about those symptoms before, and they had all the hallmarks of a poisoning. I briefly mentioned my suspicions to Gunnar, but he didn't look sold. It was probably irrelevant because the body had clearly bled to death. The deck had been soaked in blood. I didn't want to show myself up, but I'd sneak a look at the lab statement and raise my suspicions with Gunnar again if there was anything that supported my theory. I hugged Fluffy extra hard that night, sensing that I needed the comfort he snuggled close. Chapter 22. The next day, when the body was ready for identification, Gunnar and I went to the hospital's morgue to meet Stan. I'd already seen that Stan was handsome, and today he looked delicious. What was with everyone looking so amazing in this town? Was there something in the water? So I wanted a gallon of it. I ran my eyes over his muscular arms and chest and slim waist and hips. When they made it back up to his face, he was smirking at me. My cheeks warmed. Then Stan seemed to realize where we were and why, and wiped the smirk off his face. He was all business as he led the way into the morgue. It was cold inside and smelled of disinfectant and formaldehyde with an underlying scent of human waste. Lovely. Sometimes sharp vampire senses were not a gift. Gunnar pulled back the sheet and Stan stared for a second. That's Eric Walker, he said finally. I guess Stan had seen him in partially shifted form before, because even Eric's mother couldn't have identified Eric from his twisted face. Unlike shifters, werewolves were made rather than born. Eric's parents might have been fully pedestrian, and seeing their son like this would have been horrific. A closed casket would be necessary. Now he wasn't coated in blood. His otherness was even more evident. His skin was grayish and pale. The yellow tint around the eyes was still there, just a little less visible. Thanks, Stan. Sorry you had to see this, Gunnar offered. No, it's better I do it rather than a friend or a family member. My stomach clenched. Did Eric have a wife? Children? I didn't know Eric had any family. Gunnar frowned. He has a cousin or two, but none in town. I can let them know. I'd appreciate that. We left the room. Now we had a name we could start the investigation in. Ernest. Before Stan left, Gunnar asked, did Eric have any enemies? None that I knew of. As you know, we've been having issues with the fishing. Same as usual, but nothing that's affected him directly. He frowned. It's not easy to kill a werewolf. Even with all of those cuts, he should have healed. His voice turned accusatory. I'm thinking it would take a magic user to keep them from healing. We don't know anything yet. No sense guessing or accusing anyone. We need to keep the peace now more than ever. Gunnar's tone was placatory and Stan nodded, but he was still frowning. Any significant others? Girlfriend? Boyfriend? Gunnar continued. I don't know. He was straight, but I don't know if he had a current girlfriend or a live-in partner. He had a girl for a while that he yo-yoed with. Rumor was she strayed with someone else. Not sure what his current status was. Eric generally kept to himself. Is there anyone he was especially close to that I could talk to? He was friendly with Jim, the pilot. I blurted out. Stan looked at me like he'd forgotten I was there. Yeah. He looked me up and down, letting his interest show. I did my best to ignore it. Now was really not the time to get his flirt on. Good to know, Gunnar said. If you think of anything else, give me a call. Sure will. Find this bastard, Gunnar. We're on edge with the rogue werewolf, the cairn and the fish plant trying to rip us off. Things are tense. I'm worried that one more thing will set this town off like the 4th of July. I'll do my best. Do it quickly. Stan gave Gunnar a friendly clap on the shoulder and me another interested look. When he smiled wryly, I raised my eyebrow in question. He shook his head a little and walked off. I guessed he'd realized that this was not an appropriate time for flirting, and I was glad he'd got the memo, albeit a bit late. So what's next? I asked Gunnar eagerly. We'll talk to Jim and anyone else who knew Eric. We'll search his house, his car, see if he had a phone and if the one we found was his. Gunnar pulled out his own phone and searched through his contacts. He hit dial. And a few moments later grimaced faintly as the beep for voicemail clicked in. Hi Jim. I have some news for you. Give me a call when you can. He ended the call. Jim must be flying. Let's go check out Eric's house. What would a werewolf's house be like? Would there be stakes and a shrine to the moon? I was eager to find out. This detective shit was fun.